Another long day at the office for Britain's embattled Prime Minister. In Parliament, Theresa May has to fend off rival challenges within her own party. Moderate Conservatives want the House of Commons to ultimately decide the final deal with the European Union. Hard Brexiters don't want Theresa May to show her hand. Oh, and it's the day one for the introduction of the Great Repeal Bill, by which Parliament formally unmoors Britain's legal system from the continent. Expect plenty of amendments. As the clock ticks on negotiations with Brussels, the turmoil is not just within the Commons, it's also within the Cabinet. After the Mail on Sunday reported that former Tory leadership rivals Boris Johnson and Michael Gove sent Theresa May a joint letter with apparent instructions on how to run Brexit. Some even call the letter an ultimatum. What response can we expect from the PM? How safe is her own job? The turmoil between the Conservatives, mirrors deep divisions within Labour over Brexit. And after a snap election that produced a minority government and no clear trend on where to go, what does Britain really genuinely want? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a divided kingdom. With us from London, former UK trade negotiator Tom White. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
Also with us from the UK capital, Joe Merkins, who teaches law at the London School of Economics. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Alexander Holroyd, Member of Parliament, representing the French abroad and most notably the UK.
Thank you for having me.
Who shuttles on the Eurostar between Paris and London, and was with Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party. Communications consultant François Chardon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. With all the power plays that are going on in London, let's start with the first order of business this Tuesday. At Westminster, they're turning 4 decades of EU law into UK legislation. Ellen Gainsford explains about the Great Repeal Bill.
The unprecedented vote to leave the European Union has involved months of wrangling between Brussels and London. But this Tuesday, the British government will be battling on the home front as it pushes to get its Brexit legislation through Parliament. The withdrawal bill is designed to bring all EU law into UK law. Hours before the debates began, Theresa May reiterated Britain's commitment to Europe.
We remain a European nation, our history marked by shared experience, our societies shaped by common values, our economies interdependent, and our security indivisible.
The government could face defeat on key amendments to the withdrawal bill if dissident MPs ally with the Labour Party. Theresa May is already on the back foot, her minority government further weakened by scandal-hit ministers. This Monday, the Brexit Secretary David Davis said the terms of the UK's exit would be put to a parliamentary vote, a move viewed as an olive branch to Conservative Party rebels.
Parliament will be given time to debate, scrutinise and vote on the final agreement we strike with the European Union. This agreement will only hold if Parliament approves it.
Parliament may be able to reject any agreement, but Davis has admitted that the UK will be leaving the EU, whether MPs back the deal or not.
Let me begin with you, Tom White, and the reactions to what you just heard there from David Davis. There's one MP from the Conservative Party, Heidi Allen, who tweeted that having this vote as was offered, a final say on Brexit, is, quote, pointless if we have enshrined a drop-dead date into the bill and get a deal at the 11th hour. There'd be no time, she says. That's because they've also announced, the government, that, well, it actually is the 11th hour. 11 p.m. GMT on March the 29th, 2019 is when the UK is leaving the European Union. Your thoughts on the government strategy?
Well, I think the quote you had from David Davis was a very good summary of actually why it's in the government's own interests to have a form of vote on the exit treaty, because as with the triggering of Article 50, by sort of dipping the hands of MPs in the blood of the decision to approve this treaty, they will be bound by it for the future. But I would also agree with Heidi Allen that the vote is, to an extent, meaningless, but that's not because of the government itself, that's because of the nature of Article 50, which MPs voted for earlier this year by a very wide margin across both parties. And the terms of Article 50 are that if you do not agree a new treaty ratified by your own constitutional norms, then all rights and responsibilities cease to apply. So you have the kind of very hard Brexit people are concerned about. So
just Tom, to understand correctly what you've said, to get the best deal possible, you're saying that power should be in the hands of the government, not in the hands of the 600+ lawmakers in the House of Commons.
Well, the government are the ones in the room with Michel Barnier and the rest of the EU 27, not the 650 MPs. So the idea that they could somehow negotiate an alternative settlement is unrealistic. And actually what we're having now is an extension of what we've had for the last 500 days, which is Britain having a debate amongst itself rather than focusing on the debate and the negotiations with the rest of the EU. And as you said in your introduction, the clock is ticking. We are now halfway between the date of the referendum and the date of exit. And really, MPs having a debate about process and about due assessment of agreements is in many ways a distraction from the reality that Theresa May has proposed really the only strategy for Britain that is currently on the table. There is not an alternative being proposed by any main party at the moment, and I think they need to let her get on with it and make the best of these negotiations.
Joe Merkins, you agree there's no other plan on the table?
Well, there are a couple of points, really. The first is that the debates today, that started today in Parliament, are about the EU withdrawal bill. So they are about the proposed legislation that will implement EU law and prepare Britain for post-exit day. And of course, it is constitutionally right for Parliament to get involved and to scrutinise this bill line by line. So this isn't about, at this stage, handing over power to the government. It is about Parliament fulfilling its scrutiny function. There are indeed some controversial clauses in the bill that confer power on government ministers, or that as it is perceived to be, take away power from the devolved institutions in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So these are matters that need to be debated. The second point that I would say is that, yes, Britain is divided, and Tom is right about that, and that's all the more reason why Britain's stance on the future needs to be worked out, and it needs to be worked out domestically, involving not just the cabinet members, not just the governing party, but all parties in Parliament, and actually all institutions in the United Kingdom, and that includes Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and we are far away from that position.
Yeah, you mentioned devolution and the other parts of Britain. Theresa May, Joe, sitting down with the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, for the first time since the month of March this Tuesday. That's not a coincidence.
No, it's not a coincidence. This is, of course, vital because Theresa May presides over a loose coalition that I'm not just referring to the DUP members from Northern Ireland on which she is dependent, but also on Scottish Conservatives who take a slightly different approach to the process of withdrawal to some of her hardline members in England, and those are seats and votes that are very important for her. And so it is important that the Scottish voice, that the Welsh and Northern Irish voices are heard. And this is more than just a symbolic gesture to meet Nicola Sturgeon. In fact, the devolved institutions in Scotland and Wales are largely singing from the same hymn sheet. They have issued joint statements. So there is a united front as far as the devolved institutions are concerned, but there is not a united front as far as Westminster is concerned.
Alexander Holroyd, you couldn't offer a starker contrast between the UK, where the government's divided, the parliament's divided, the nations of Britain are perhaps seemingly divided to a certain degree, and here in France, where, you have a strong president, overwhelming majority in the parliament where you sit. What are your thoughts on that, about the way Britain's democracy is handling what's going on with Brexit?
Well, I think that it's an issue for everyone. Listen, I think that there's on the one side, there's a European negotiator which has behind him all the member states of the EU. And at the moment, what's really needed, and I think, Tom, I agree with what Tom was saying, is the clock is ticking. We've got about a year left to conclude a deal, if you think that it needs then to be ratified by 28 member states, including the UK, potentially. And so it's absolutely essential that the negotiations progress and move on to phase 2. And for that, there needs to be some progress in the upcoming negotiations on citizens' rights, because you have 300,000 French people who live in the UK and who've lived there, some of them who've lived there for decades, and who are really concerned about their future. You have this Northern Ireland border question, which really needs to be sorted, and which is very complicated. And you have the financial settlement, which, although it attracts a lot of attention, I think is less complicated than the two former issues. And at the moment, what Europe needs is a partner which is a solid partner which to negotiate with, and a partner which can be trusted to then implement whatever agreement is found.
Does it have that?
At the moment, what we're looking for, I think, from a European perspective, is to ensure that Parliament, government, all the devolved nations will be behind the eventual agreement, because that's essential for the progression of negotiations.
But you heard Tom White mention now that the UK spent 500 days arguing amongst itself right now. So what does that mean for your constituents in the UK?
Well, it means an incredible level of anxiety, obviously, because actually some of the progress which has been made in negotiation is on that critical issue of citizens' rights. And obviously this is contingent on a deal happening. So, I mean, for the French who live in the UK, and more broadly, all the Europeans who live in the UK, and all of the UK residents who live in Europe, it's absolutely essential that there's a negotiation with two credible partners who now move on to phase number 2 and to try and hash out a deal within the very, very tight time frame that we now have in front of us.
François Chardon, there's how do you get the best deal possible? And there's how do you represent the will of the people? And those seem to be two different things.
Yes, it seems like now the British powers put itself into a bind with its opinion set on Brexit and its political class ready to implement it, but in such a disorderly fashion right now, and with such a weakened number 10, that it seems that the negotiating table there's not a real party facing the negotiator for the EU 27.
You heard Tom White's argument. Theresa May's the only one with a plan. So she's the one that we must follow. Why isn't that working, though?
Well, it's there's a lot of there's an obvious division within that majority, not just within the country, and so it's there's a lack of order even in the way that that this government is run. We've seen that with the recent reshuffle that had to occur. There's an obvious lack of discipline within that government. That in a way is a contrast to the French executive right now.
Contrast to the French executive. So what advice would you give from a communications point of view?
I would refrain certainly to give advice to our neighbors, but I wish for them to somehow manage to set a due course as soon as possible, because no negotiation can happen without that, and right now it seems that it's we are getting towards a possible hard Brexit, which would be terrible.
Possible hard Brexit, and when we come back, we'll take a look at how this might be, well, redefining UK's democracy, and whether or not Theresa May will be steering the ship all the way to that 2019 date. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
My name is Jessica Saltz and I'm the Berlin correspondent for France 24. You can find my coverage of German news from here in the capital and beyond on France 24's news programmes and also online at france24.com.
Jessica Saltz, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.
Sports, presented by Ketevan Gojestani.
France 24 keeps you up to date with all the latest from the world of sport. All the action, all the results, all the emotion.
Sports on France 24 and France24.com.
I find the team here at France 24 humble, hard-working, and with their feet on the ground.
C'est une des seules chaînes d'infos où on nous laisse jouer en plateau avec des Legos, avec des robots, avec tout un tas d'objets.
We take a return ticket to revisit some of the key people and places of the last 50 years of world television news.
على فرانس 24 يمكننا أن نحاور أصحاب القرار من العالم في كل الميادين ولدينا المساحة لكشف ثنايا مسيرتهم.
Les femmes, elles sont souvent victimes de l'actualité internationale, mais ce sont aussi des actrices majeures de la géopolitique. Et d'ailleurs, on en parle dans France 24.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information. Everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24, a different take on the news.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. But before we resume it, let's give you a sample of the stories we're following in the newsroom. French investigators have raided the Paris headquarters of Franco-Swiss cement giant Lafarge, part of the probe into alleged protection money paid to keep open its operations in ISIS-controlled parts of Syria back in 2013 and 2014. U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions now remembers a March 2016 Trump campaign meeting with an aide, since been convicted of lying to the FBI over dealings with Russia. In Zimbabwe, tanks reportedly at the gates of the capital one day after the Army Chief of Staff warned President Mugabe over the replacement of his vice president, potentially with First Lady Grace Mugabe. The ruling ZANU-PF party says it will never succumb to pressure from the military. Russia to restructure some $3 billion of debt from Venezuela, this after credit agencies deemed Caracas in selective default for the first time in decades. Kate Moody will have all the day's business. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're talking at the outset of the Great Repeal Bill being introduced into the UK Parliament, a measure that will take all the EU laws and make them British jurisdiction. It's the first of, according to one newspaper report, 10 pieces of legislation that, if there's too much backbench dissent, could bring down the government of Theresa May. We're talking about with former UK trade negotiator Tom White, Joe Merkins, who teaches law at the London School of Economics. Welcome back as well. Here in the studio, Alexander Holroyd, member of the French Parliament representing the French abroad for Northern Europe, including the United Kingdom, and communications consultant François Chardon. Welcome back to all of you. Joe Merkins, let me begin with you and just ask you, leaving the EU, is it redefining Britain's democracy?
When people say that the process of leaving the European Union is the biggest event that the United Kingdom has had to deal with in peacetime, I think they're right. We are in the process of redefining our relationship with the European Union, and we can talk more about what precisely that means. But incidentally, we are also restructuring our entire constitutional order, but without really talking about it. So yes, it does have an impact on the relationship between government and parliament. As we can see, right from the beginning, government was trying to assert its control over the process of withdrawal from Article 50 to the EU withdrawal bill. And right from the start, we've seen Parliament struggle to assert its power and its scrutinising function. It was a year ago, it was timid. Now it is becoming more assertive. And then what is also going on is that the relationship between Westminster and the autonomous authorities in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is also changing. But this isn't part of the debate. The debate is about Brexit, but not about its constitutional implications.
Ultimately, though, will Parliament be stronger, or will you have a stronger executive branch of government when this tussle is over?
Well, the promise was to take back control to Parliament. So hopefully Parliament will be as strong as it is now or stronger. But that really ultimately depends on how much power individual MPs are willing to assert. And we can see parliamentarians now making quite bold moves and inserting, taking the scrutiny process seriously and inserting powerful insertions into the withdrawal bill, which a year ago was not happened. It was a more complacent parliament. So, but one thing that should definitely not happen is for the government to emerge stronger and for Parliament to emerge weaker. That would be a travesty.
Yeah, you mentioned backbenchers or MPs in general scrutinizing more. Case in point, veteran Conservative member of Parliament, Ken Clarke. He doesn't like that idea of a deadline being put on the, what is it, March the, I forgot it here, March 29th, 2019. Let's listen to him.
Once we're going, they won't want to stay in very much longer because they won't want us around for the European Parliament elections. But actually, it will be utterly foolish if 28 governments all agree to extend the process and the British representative had to say, but we've put into British law a timing which says to the second when we're actually leaving. And that is, it seems to me, a rather serious flaw to the amendment.
Tom White, do you agree?
I think he is right on this. And the fact is that introducing this amendment about a deadline was actually in many ways a symptom of how distracted by process this debate has been, in that with the soft Brexiters arguing for a meaningful vote, of course that then provokes the more hard Brexiters to advocate for a hard deadline. And in many ways, they're all just talking about process. But I would take issue with what Joe was saying about that there are risks of the executive becoming stronger, because if you look at the government's record in the last 6 months, it's actually done very little on its domestic agenda. It's been consistently voted down by Parliament. We see MPs from both parties working with each other to vote for policy change on issues such as benefits and other questions. And I think it's entirely to be expected that after Brexit, Parliament will hold the executive much more aggressively to account. And it's very important that the devolved administrations and others are involved in aspects of policy change that arise from Brexit through things like the new trade policy, the new migration policy, the new fisheries policy, all these areas of sort of new policy for the UK. But within this particular bill, this is simply about creating some legal certainty for the point of Brexit to reduce the chances of a more chaotic transition. So in many ways, the parliamentarians are focusing on the wrong thing. They are becoming more powerful in other areas, and it would be better if they focused on that rather than on these points of process, which are a bit of a distraction.
Yeah, and the clock ticking once again. It's not just parliamentarians piling on the pressure, by the way. The week began with the pound starting to skid, falling below €1.12, dropping nearly 5% against the European currency since the start of the year. In an editorial entitled "The Onus is on Britain to Unblock Brexit Talks," the Financial Times writes, "It is doubtful whether the Prime Minister can secure a deal on transition before businesses start to vote with their feet." Your thoughts on that, François Chardon?
Well, it's definitely pressure building from the economic world, and we can see the economic consequences of a hard Brexit starting to materialize in a way with this impact on currency. And I saw also, since you were mentioning the Financial Times, the column from Gideon Rachman entitled "Brexit Britain is at Europe's Mercy." He sees the weakening position of the Prime Minister and of the British government as really a threat should there be no real advance before the next EU summit. There might be announcements by major banks and companies that they will definitely leave the UK.
Is that good or bad news, Alexandre Halroyd? If those companies start to leave the UK, some are saying that the French and the Germans are driving too hard a bargain, and that, well, it's no one's interest to wreck the UK economy.
I think there's really broad consensus on that. I mean, on both sides of the channel, there is a recognition that a hard Brexit, well, there's a broad recognition, bar a few exceptions, that a hard Brexit will be bad for the economy and bad for citizens on both sides of the channel. So I don't think there's any appetite to create, in any circumstances, a big crisis. We have lived through a couple of big crises in Europe, in the European area, in the Eurozone over the past 10 years. There is no appetite to see that happening again. But what needs to happen now is progress on those negotiations to arrive to a deal which curtails that from happening, which prevents that from happening. I think the key thing to understand here is what Tom was mentioning, is that this is a negotiation of immense complexity, which impacts every sector and the way every industry is regulated in the UK.
If there's not significant progress, if there isn't that significant progress by the end of December,
it will be up to both negotiators on both sides to see what is potentially the future, and is there enough time to sort of build up to a real agreement?
What are the chances right now in your view?
It's absolutely no. I mean, I'm not going to sort of come out with probabilities. I just think that there's been quite a lot of time wasted on minor details in a framework which has an enormous impact on both sides of the borders. And I mean, you can see what can be accomplished in 6 months if you look at France in terms of actually delivering an agenda at national level. I mean, we've reformed the labour market, we've passed a budget which lowers sort of capital gain tax. There can be an enormous amount of progress which can be accomplished in 6 months if really all forces of a country get behind a government, get behind a majority and progress. So, listen, on both sides, and on the European side for the moment, there is this consensus. So on the UK side, there needs to be this consensus that we need to progress to make sure that we reassure citizens, businesses, and everybody who will be impacted by whatever happens on that date of March 2019.
Let's roll back the clock to June 2016 and just remind our viewers of the timeline then. There was the vote, 52% in favor of Brexit. There was the Prime Minister, David Cameron, resigning a leadership contest. And after that leadership contest, well, the beginning of negotiations that were to start. However, many feeling that there's sort of that leadership contest perhaps being revisited. Well, with that leaked letter to Theresa May from Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, published in the Mail on Sunday, Johnson and Gove, who stabbed each other in the back during the leadership race, according to that newspaper, they've buried the hatchet, and they sent this letter, which, as you can see, is being called by the paper an ultimatum to Theresa May on how to handle Brexit negotiations. Tom White, explain for us on this side of the channel, what's this all about?
Well, that is the elephant in the room, really, for what's been happening in Parliament today as well, that people do smell an opportunity. They can see a prime minister who is weak, and many in her own party are thinking about whether they'd like to replace her. I don't think anyone is 100% dead set on standing for the leadership, but many of them see an opportunity. You also see an opportunity on the Labour benches to inflict embarrassing defeats on the government and potentially trigger an election which they believe they could win, and perhaps form a government with the Scottish nationalists. So it's partly the political vulnerability of Theresa May following that election that makes many within Parliament see opportunities and therefore incentives to make things more difficult. But I think if we look back to summer of last year, when really Theresa May was the last person standing in her leadership contest because the other candidates, for one reason or another, imploded, I suspect we could see something similar were a leadership bid to be triggered this time. It's very difficult to see anyone with the credibility to take on the leadership of the party, to bring together the more than 70 people who are very adamantly in favour of leaving, with a remainder of 200 or so who are very keen to remain close links to the EU. It's very difficult to see another Prime Minister unifying that party, and so she has a very difficult job, and she could well fall as a consequence, but it's very difficult to see an alternative, and this is why many predict the government to continue to sort of move along unspectacularly in the way that it has for the last few months.
Joe Merkins, for many the perception is that Brexit vote was triggered because of arguments within the Conservative Party. Those arguments seem to still be playing out.
Well, the 1975 referendum was held to settle divisions within the Labour Party, and the 2016 referendum was held to settle divisions in the Conservative Party. And you are absolutely right, these divisions are not a few years old, they are decades old, and they're not going to go away even after we've left the European Union. I'm sure that the debate will start about rejoining the European Union at some point. So these issues are semi-permanent and they are divisive, and Theresa May is not the first Prime Minister to have had to grapple with this.
And are we starting to see, Joe, the beginning of what we witnessed here in France, and which Alexandre Holroyd can attest to, which is political parties shifting completely? Because it sounds like the moderate Labour Party MPs and the moderate Conservatives today have more in common with each other than they do with the leadership of their own party.
So a few months ago, or even a year ago, there was talk about maybe a new party forming, right, of pro-European centrists, and that hasn't happened. And I don't think that's a big surprise. What we do see now is a looser form of coalition building within the House of Commons over the issue of Brexit, I suppose. And that's not surprising either, and that's not unprecedented. So MPs are, technically speaking, independently minded MPs who are supposed to vote with their conscience. We know that doesn't happen all the time, but on big issues, it does happen, and MPs have been known to breach party lines in order to, on the grounds of principle, and EU. The future of the UK's relationship with the European Union is a point of principle.
Alexandre Holroyd, why is it that in France we have La République En Marche, which is this new party which has elements from the old Socialist Party, from the old Conservative Party, and in Britain we don't? Why is that?
Listen, I'm always very careful with international comparisons. What I do know here is that there was a politician, Emmanuel Macron, who came up and who identified serious problems within the functioning of parties which didn't represent anymore the will of the people and which failed to reform this country. I mean, for 30 years we had a period where there were very few reforms. And there was really a desire, a profound desire from the French people to see a government which could, reform different elements of the economy, different elements of the social system, so that we could develop competitiveness.
Or just simply that the political fault lines had changed.
So the political fault lines had changed, and the absence of reform for decades had created a general sense that sort of politicians were just not up to the task. And that's where this movement comes from, and that's the movement I'm part of.
All right. Let me ask, there was last week, we have this deadline set in stone. We talk about where it's all going to go. François Chardon, at this point in time, you heard what Tom White had to say. Yes, Theresa May is weakened, but no, there is no alternative. What does she do to sort of regain the upper hand within her own cabinet, within her own party?
Well, it seems that she's trying to put her house in order, in the sense that she had just this reshuffling happening, and there's the sense that with this vote also the parliament will be put in front of its own responsibilities to the public opinion. So in that sense, I think she's trying as best as she can to weather the storm, and she's also sending messages abroad that in a way try to reassure her. We've seen this new
the meeting she had on Monday with business leaders.
Yes, and even a visit to Japan, the one she just had, is clearly aimed to demonstrate that the UK can stand on its own and conclude possibly new trade deals in the future, as it would with the European Union in its new capacity.
Tom White, we've had ministers resign over completely unrelated matters to Brexit. The Defence Secretary over sex scandal, the International Development Secretary over an unauthorized trip to Israel. Things that have nothing to do with Brexit whatsoever, yet each time one of these resignations happens, everybody looks at it through the prism of Brexit.
They do, and I think when Theresa May lost the didn't lose the election, but lost her majority at the last election, there was a sense that she would just be vulnerable. It's a bit like if your immune system is down when you've had an infection, and then you catch another one because your body is weak. And so being vulnerable to these problems with individual ministers has certainly weakened her. But I think she has also struggled to really articulate a narrative for the government beyond delivering Brexit. And so when it came to replacing those ministers, the main questions were, she needs to appoint a Remain supporting minister to the defence portfolio. She needs to appoint a Leave supporting minister to the development portfolio, rather than other sorts of ideological questions or questions of competence. And the problem for her is that she has probably one more opportunity this year, with the budget planned for the 22nd of November, to really show what is her government for. Unfortunately, I suspect that it may end up being a fairly simple answer, which is that her government is simply there to deliver Brexit. And if that's the case, then that's what they'll be judged against.
All right, Brexit all the time. I want to thank you, Tom White, for joining us from London. I want to thank as well Joe Merkins, Alexandre Hallroyd, and François Chardon. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
The UK Prime Minister, okay, my take from what we just heard is her job is safe for the time being, because there's no other alternative.
I know, it's not really the greatest ringing endorsement, is it? There's really not anybody else to take over from her. I think there is a feeling that really is the case. And certainly when you look at the work of the British cartoonists right now, and you can say, well, hey, they're maybe more liberal than your average UK citizen. But you do wonder how we ever ended up in this situation with the UK voting to leave Europe. Here we have David Davis, who is, of course, in charge, supposedly, of the UK's exit from the European Union, driving around in circles because basically he has no choice. He is on a teeny tiny little island there where all he can do is a U-turn, as it says in the top left-hand corner there. And in his hand, he's waving aloft the new Brexit bill. Banks in the Financial Times has this take on it, and she's reading from the EU No Deal book. And she says, these halcyon days before plunging headlong off a cliff won't last forever. And it does feel a little bit like that. You know, the parachutes haven't been strapped on. No one quite knows what's going to happen next. And the number of possible options seems to grow by the minute. This is another piece from The Times, from Morton Morland. We have the Speaker of the Houses of Parliament there saying the lies have it. And I think that's referring to the Brexiteers who promised all kinds of things which don't appear to be coming true now. However, it is worth remembering that there were reasons for people voting to leave the EU. This was a word cloud created by the answers of people who voted to leave. It was done back in July 2016 by the British Election Study, and it's been resurrected for a piece in Politico written by the Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, Matthew Goodwin. And it's worth taking a look at this one. It's quite interesting. He says undoubtedly the main driver behind Brexit, as revealed by that graphic, was concern about free movement, immigration and its impact on the country. But interestingly, what he says is that nobody, neither the Conservatives nor the Labour Party in opposition, are providing people with any feeling that their concerns are being addressed. They're simply not looking at the issue of immigration for fear of upsetting people and losing support. And so what he says is that they run the risk of having disgruntled voters move much further to the right. And he says that will make UKIP look like a quirky brand of old-school Conservatives. UKIP, of course, the UK Independence Party, who are pretty right of right, I think it's fair to say. But he says that could be something that, in comparison, is very mild to what we end up with if this key problem of immigration isn't addressed.
Isn't addressed, Alexandre Holroyd, the resentment is towards fellow EU members, not the French constituents that you represent in the UK, but more people from Eastern Europe. How do the French citizens feel about the fact that, well, Brexit was in a large part about immigration?
Well, I think we go back to the same point. Is you have a community of people and who are real people behind those negotiations and who've been living there for sometimes 20 years, who might have a spouse who is English, who have kids who are English, and they just don't know what their status is going to be in a year and a half. And I mean, you have that community who's incredibly worried about their future. And the only way to give them a clear answer is to progress those negotiations.
Well, just on that subject, I looked at this tweet earlier on today, and it really sort of jumped out at me as an English person living in France and obviously knowing other European friends who are living in London. It's not the politicians who will suffer under Brexit, it's families. And this is a tweet from a lady who moved to the UK more than a decade ago, has children, and she found this letter written by her child, a letter to Santa Claus, Father Christmas, saying, this Christmas I would like my mummy to be allowed to stay in England because I don't want to lose my family or friends. And it is very easy, as you say, when you get caught up in the politics, to forget that there are real lives involved here.
And that summarises much better than I would ever be able to summarise.
All right, I want to thank you so much, Emma James. I want to thank our panelists once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.